Unless the trade systems change, there is no way that we're going to be able to deal with climate change effectively. And what I want to do is just show you what some of the bits of the jigsaw puzzle are and how they all fit together. So the first thing is that there are ongoing trade negotiations in the World Trade Organization, but also in hundreds of different bilateral trade agreements between different countries. So the European Union, for example, has Global Europe policy and is making deals with countries in ACP countries, with countries in the Andean region, with countries in Central America. And their focus is really to get a good trade deal to work for Europe's economy. And the whole sort of process underlying the free trade paradigm, if you like, is that the market should be in control and you need to remove government interventions. So, of course, from the point of view of the environment or climate change, that's often removing regulations that you would otherwise put in place to stop climate change or to promote other environmental goods. And what's happening in the World Trade Organization at the moment, and has been happening for the last 9 years, is a set of negotiations that covers all sorts of different sectors. And lots of them are very, very relevant to climate change, as was mentioned in the introduction. So there's a huge focus on expanding industrial agriculture, for example. And one of the reasons the negotiations are stuck at the moment, which is a very good thing, is that the US really wants to open up markets for its agricultural exports in developing countries, and that threatens small farmers, millions of small farmers around the world, and developing countries are currently saying, no, we're not going to let you do that. Another way in which the negotiations, well, I should say that, of course, industrial agriculture is actually based, it's very, very fossil fuel intensive in terms of the machinery that's used, the production of fertilizers, the distribution of food. So compared with small-scale, sustainable farming, it really makes a huge difference when it comes to climate change. There's another set of negotiations in the WTO which are about non-agricultural market access, which is called NAMA for short, and that covers everything except agriculture. And there are governments in there that are trying to completely liberalise the forest sector, all raw materials, and in the same way, forests are absolutely critical to climate change because not only do they store carbon, but they also help to regulate the world's hydrological cycles, and they affect weather. So absolutely critical. If there's any kind of trade negotiation that's having an impact on forests, it's going to have an impact on climate change. And the third big, the third big part of the negotiations is on services. And there are a number of countries, including the EU, that are trying to drive the liberalisation of energy services. So that's things like exploring for oil and extracting it and distributing it. You're not actually selling the product, but you're doing all the services that are related to it. And that also will, if it went through, would constrain governments' ability to really control the extent to which energy and fossil fuels are being extracted. Now, those three sectors are absolutely critical because energy supply is responsible for 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and forests and agriculture for another 31%. So you're talking about over 50% of all emissions are related to expansion in those sectors. But the interesting thing is, now, this was true the last time I looked at a WTO paper. There is a slim possibility it could have changed. You never, ever see climate change mentioned in any of these sectoral papers, which I think is a crime, really. You know, if you're going to argue for the expansion of your sector, you ought to be able to justify, under the current circumstances, what the climate change impacts are or aren't going to be. This trade language and trade mentality actually appears in multilateral environmental agreements as well. Many of you may have heard of the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, and that's quite a famous multilateral environmental agreement because it actually used trade restrictions on governments that hadn't signed the agreement, and that sort of restriction is absolutely taboo now. under sort of the free trade mentality, you just don't do that. And what you do get is agreements like the UN Framework Climate Change Convention and the Kyoto Protocol have explicit language in them saying that they may not include anything that's a disguised restriction on trade. So right in the heart of the agreements we've already got, they're saying trade takes priority. And in my experience, when you go to some of the other multilateral environmental agreements, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's the same with the climate change negotiations, when I stopped working on trade and I went to work on some other environmental issues, and I went to these negotiations and I found they were trade negotiations. They're really just talking about who's going to benefit financially from this, that and the other. So in the Biodiversity Convention, you've got people arguing over access and benefit sharing and who's going to get the benefits. And they're really talking about the money and not the biodiversity. And it's the same thing when you go to climate change negotiations. The corridors are lined with carbon brokers and people that are planning to make some money out of the situation. And it really distracts people from thinking about what the real solutions are.